Hey, I want to talk to you about a really incredible podcast I just listened to, and it was called, the title of this episode on the Ezra Show, Why Do We Work So Damn Much? That's a pretty good question. And it focuses on, really begins with an essay by John Maynard Keynes, famous economist, who tried to step back during the Great Depression and envision what is the economic future for, say, our grandchildren. What will the future be like, specifically through that economic lens? And he envisioned how the progress of technology and the continued material advancement was going to lead to huge increases in productivity, GDP, all these sorts of things, to the extent that in 100 years we would be able to basically work 15 hours a week and have all our desires and needs met and then some. And so, how did this prediction play out? Well, it turns out he was wrong on both counts. He was wrong in that he actually very, very much underestimated the material and technological advancement. In terms of GDP per capita, or how much we're all making, we're levels beyond what he predicted and what's necessary to basically satisfy our basic needs. He was also wrong in terms of how our relationship with work has evolved. We've leveraged these technologies and resources really to work more and work more neurotically. In the podcast, he mentions how high earners, something like 20% are working more than 50 hours a week, another 20% more than 30 hour or more than 60 hours a week, and I think 10% more than 80 hours a week. And so he invites onto the podcast an anthropologist, James Suzman, who has specialized in studying the human relationship to work. And he spent a lot of time living with hunter-gatherers and analyzing how they relate to work. And what he finds is surprising. There tended to be, for many years, a view of hunter-gatherers as basically on the edge of survival, working sun up to sundown, 7 days a week, just getting enough to scrape by. It was basically a life of brutish suffering, is how they described it. But what they find is that these hunter-gatherer groups often only worked about 15 to 17 hours a week, and that was on work that was very intrinsically motivating, like hunting. And they had a lot of time for leisure. They also were fairly healthy, had varied diets, good communities set up, and so they did very well. And the reason they know this is basically they've studied now all these different hunter-gathering groups, small groups that still exist today, and they've kind of converged around a similar lifestyle of that, 17-hour weeks, leisure time, certain values that they all have in common. And so Suzman posits that it's not necessarily part of our biological evolution that drives us to work so much. Of course, work is a part of our fundamental nature, and it's very important that we do some work. But he says this is a lot more of a sort of cultural inertia, or product of cultural forces. And what he really focuses on is this idea that I think is very powerful. It's the idea of manufactured desires or manufactured scarcity. And basically he says, that as that Keynes essay kind of pointed out, we've essentially defeated economic scarcity in the developed world. But what happened in a kind of consumerist culture is we then decided we had to invent scarcity. We had to manufacture scarcity to keep that engine turning, because if your wants are just satisfied, then you say, oh, okay, we kind of step back. I don't need to keep working as much, right? And they kind of lose, right, the very engine that keeps this consumer culture churning. So he even offers a story of, I believe in the mid 1900s, it was that like a large manufacturing company actually did switch to 30-hour weeks. And they said, we can maintain the same level of productivity. We can still pay people roughly the same, and we can do just as well, but everyone will have way more time off. And they did that for a little bit, and it ended up being actually the workers who pushed to go back to a 45-hour week. And Suzman points out that the timing of this, and when those workers wanted to come back and work more, was right during the advent of advertising. And advertising is exactly this thing he points out. It's this manufacturing of wants, manufacturing of desires, manufacturing of scarcity, kind of that feeling that you need more and more and more. And he talks about how ultimately advertising and this sort of cultural force that, again, feeds on itself leads to this sort of this scarcity treadmill where we look around and we feel like we never have enough and we're going after a moving target, and that means that it's very difficult to find happiness even when faced with all this material abundance that we have in the first world. And so I think that really is an interesting way that challenges all of us to reconsider a little bit how we think about work. And what Suzman leaves us with is that we're a very adaptable species, and as we continue to progress, we're going to likely see continued rising in inequality, continued automation of work, and so we're likely going to be faced with a bit of a cultural crisis. But he says that this sort of cultural crisis or a cultural evolution is ultimately what's going to be necessary for us to really learn how to cope with abundance, right? To stop manufacturing desires and actually learn how to be happy with this material abundance that we do have. So really interesting idea, and I'll share a link to that podcast, and I'd love to have you let me know what you think.